Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And today, we're tackling a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz, mega, but not the one you might be thinking of.
Right.
This mega is all about making Europe great again, a concept focused on boosting the EU's competitiveness on the global stage.
It's a hot topic, for sure.
We've got our hands on a thought-provoking report from the Elcano Royal Institute. And let me tell you, this is not your typical dry policy document.
Not at all.
It's packed with insights and data that paint a vivid picture of where Europe stands and where it needs to go.
And it doesn't sugarcoat the challenges.
Absolutely. It acknowledges that there's a widening gap between the EU and the US, especially when it comes to economic performance.
Yeah.
Like per capita GDP.
Yeah, Krugman's famous quote comes to mind. Productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything.
Sobering words.
Right.
But the report doesn't just dwell on the negatives.
Right. It lays out a roadmap.
It provides a framework for action outlining 9 key drivers of competitiveness that Europe needs to focus on.
Think of it like analyzing an athlete's performance. You got to look at their vital stats to see where they excel and where they need to improve.
Makes sense. So let's jump right in. What's the first driver on this competitiveness checklist?
The single market? You'd think with all those countries working together, the EU would have this one in the bag, right?
Yeah, you'd assume so. Free movement of goods, services, capital. It's like the cornerstone of the EU.
But here's the catch. While the EU actually surpasses the US in private investment as a percentage of GDP, there's a twist.
Oh, I sense a but coming.
There is those pesky internal trade barriers, especially for services. They're like speed bumps on the road to a truly unified market.
So they're putting money in, but it's not flowing freely enough.
That's the issue. The report highlights that only a quarter of large businesses in the EU are selling online across borders.
Really? Only 25%?
And for smaller companies, it's even worse. Less than 10%. Think about all that untapped potential.
Wow, that's a huge missed opportunity. I mean, imagine if it were that hard to sell something online from California to New York. The U.S. economy would be in trouble.
Exactly. And then there's the whole debate around state aid.
State aid.
Yeah.
That's where governments give financial support to certain companies or industries.
Right, exactly. Countries like Germany and France, they're using it strategically. But does it create an uneven playing field for others? The recent Temporary Crisis and Transition Framework, or TCTF, has really stirred the pot on this issue.
Okay, so TCTF. Break that down for me. What's the big deal?
Imagine you're a small business in, say, Portugal, trying to compete with a German company that's getting a boost from the government. It's tough, right? The TCTF is meant to address these concerns by allowing other EU countries to also give state aid to their companies in certain situations.
So it's an attempt to level the playing field.
Yeah, but it's also controversial. Some worry it could lead to a subsidy race and distort competition.
So it's a delicate balancing act, trying to support innovation and growth without creating unfair advantages.
Exactly. It highlights a fundamental tension within the EU, finding the right balance between national interests and collective action.
Okay, 1 driver down, 8 more to go.
Oh.
What's next on our competitiveness checklist?
Let's talk about money, specifically how Europeans are investing it.
Okay, this should be interesting.
Here's a mind-blowing statistic. European households hold most of their assets in cash and deposits, while U.S. households are much more likely to invest in stocks and funds.
Really? Why is that? Are Europeans just more risk-averse?
It's a complex mix of factors. Some point to cultural differences, a preference for stability over rapid growth. Others argue that it's the structure of financial markets, with the EU being much more reliant on bank financing than capital markets.
So it's like they're putting their money under the mattress instead of putting it to work.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And this has big implications. It affects everything from access to capital for businesses to how resilient an economy is to shocks.
Makes sense. So less investment means less growth and less innovation.
Exactly. The report points out that the EU's dependence on bank financing is a whopping 30 percentage points higher than the U.S. That's a significant gap.
So if banks tighten up lending during a crisis, the EU could be hit harder.
Precisely. And this brings us to our next driver, public investment.
Public investment. That's government spending on things like infrastructure, research, and education, right?
Exactly. And while the U.S. is currently outspending the EU in this area, the gap is closing. However, there's another crucial factor to consider: fiscal sustainability.
Fiscal sustainability, meaning keeping debt under control.
Right. And here, the EU shines. The EU's public debt to GDP ratio is significantly lower than the U.S. by a full 40 percentage points.
Wow, that's impressive. So they're in a better position for the long haul.
Potentially, yes. It's like the tortoise and the hare. The U.S. might be sprinting ahead now with higher public investment, but the EU's steady, sustainable approach could win the race in the end.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these different pieces of the puzzle fit together.
Right.
But let's be honest, in today's world, it's all about technology and innovation. How does the EU stack up there?
That's where things get a little more complicated. Research and development are crucial, and while the EU does well with patent applications, they're lagging behind in actual R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP. Both the US and South Korea are outpacing them.
So they've got the ideas, but not necessarily the investment to bring them to life.
Right. And there's another key element missing: technology transfer, getting those brilliant ideas out of the lab and into the market where they can actually make a difference. That's where the EU needs to step up its game.
Okay, so we've covered three drivers so far. The single market access to capital and public investment, each with its own set of challenges and opportunities.
Exactly. And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack in this
Okay,
report.
well then, let's keep digging. We'll be back in the next part of our deep dive to explore the remaining drivers of competitiveness and what they mean for Europe's future. Stay tuned. All right, so we've talked about investment, innovation, public spending. What about energy? Everyone's talking about energy these days. How does that fit into the picture?
That's driver number 5. And it's a bit of a mixed bag for the EU.
Oh, really? How so?
On the one hand, they're ahead of the game when it comes to renewable energy use, way ahead of the US.
That's great for the planet.
Right. Absolutely. But there's a trade-off.
Always a trade-off, isn't there?
What is it?
The cost of electricity in some major EU countries like Germany, it's significantly higher than in the US.
Like how much higher?
Double in some cases.
Ouch. That's got to hurt businesses, especially energy-intensive industries like manufacturing.
Exactly. It raises questions about the economic sustainability of those green ambitions if they drive up costs that much.
It's a tough balancing act for sure, trying to be green but also stay competitive.
Right. It highlights the need for a holistic approach to energy policy, one that balances environmental goals with economic realities. But let's move on to the next driver.
Circularity.
Circularity.
Okay.
Now, that's one I'm not as familiar with. What's that all about?
Think of it as the opposite of our traditional take, make, dispose model. It's about keeping resources in use for as long as possible, designing products that can be easily repaired, reused, recycled.
So it's like closing the loop on the whole production and consumption cycle.
Precisely. And the EU has a lot of potential in this area. They're already leading the way in recycling certain materials, like copper, zinc, aluminum.
That's good news, especially with all the talk about resource scarcity these days.
It is. But there are challenges.
There always are. What are some of the hurdles?
Well, for one thing, product design needs to become more recycling friendly, and better labeling would make it easier to identify materials for proper sorting and recycling.
Yeah, I've definitely struggled with those confusing recycling symbols. Sometimes I'm not even sure if something goes in the bin or not.
Exactly. It needs to be clear and easy for consumers to participate. But let's move on to a driver that's absolutely essential in today's world: digitalization.
Okay, digitalization. So we're talking about everything from online services to artificial intelligence?
And everything in between. And this is where the EU has some serious catching up to do.
Really? I thought Europe was pretty tech-savvy.
There's been progress. But the EU, particularly its small and medium-sized enterprises, is lagging behind in adopting digital technologies. Remember that ambitious goal of 75% of EU companies using AI by 2030?
Yeah, that was a bold target.
Well, we're nowhere close. The current figure is a dismal 7.7%.
Wow. So what's holding them back?
A lot of factors. But a major one is the lack of digital skills in the workforce. Over 25% of the EU's working-age population lacks even secondary education, and the percentage of ICT specialists is far below what's needed to drive a digital economy.
So it's not just about having the technology, it's about having the people who know how to use it.
Precisely. And this skills gap is a major roadblock to the EU's competitiveness. Meanwhile, U.S. tech giants are running circles around everyone, dominating market capitalization, cloud computing, high-quality chip production. It's a digital divide that needs to be addressed urgently.
Okay, so digital skills are crucial. What about education and skills more broadly? How does that factor in?
That's our next driver, and it's closely linked to digitalization. The report emphasizes the need for lifelong learning, upskilling, and reskilling programs, a greater focus on STEM education.
It's like that saying, what got you here won't get you there. You've got to keep learning and adapting to stay ahead of the curve.
Exactly. And this is especially important in a world where technology is changing so rapidly. Jobs are being automated. New industries are emerging. The skills needed today might be obsolete tomorrow.
So preparing the workforce for the future is essential.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to our final driver trade and what the report calls Open strategic autonomy.
Open strategic autonomy.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What does it mean?
It's about finding the right balance between openness to global trade and the ability to act independently when necessary.
So striking that balance between cooperation and competition.
Exactly. Now, on the surface, the EU seems to be doing quite well in this area. They're a global leader in exports of goods. They have a current account surplus, unlike the US.
So they're selling more than they're buying. That sounds like a good thing, right? It can be. But some economists argue that this surplus could actually be a sign of weakness.
Really? How so?
It means the EU is essentially exporting savings that could be invested domestically. Plus, the global trade landscape is changing rapidly. The EU's share of world exports is declining, and those traditional free trade agreements are becoming less common.
So they can't just rest on their laurels and assume things will stay the same.
Right. They need to be proactive and adapt to this new reality.
Okay, so we've covered all 9 drivers of competitiveness, from the single market to trade and open strategic autonomy. It's been quite a journey.
It has, but we've only just scratched the surface.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. The report goes even deeper, exploring factors that go beyond those 9 key areas. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into those hidden depths. What else is the report highlighting? It feels like we've been on this incredible journey through this report, unearthing all these fascinating insights about what makes an economy tick, what makes it competitive. You're right. At the end of the day, it's about people. It's about creating a Europe where people feel optimistic about the future, not just surviving, but thriving.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really exciting, because we're not just talking about tweaking a few policies here and there. We're talking about a vision for Europe's future.
Okay, a vision. So paint me a picture.
Yeah.
What would a truly great Europe look like?
Well, for starters, it would be a Europe where the single market truly lives up to its name. Imagine a seamless flow of goods, services, capital across borders, fueling innovation and entrepreneurship.
So breaking down those internal barriers we talked about earlier, making it easier to do business across borders.
Exactly. And it's not just about reducing red tape, it's also about fostering a culture of collaboration, cross-border partnerships. Think of it as a network of interconnected hubs of innovation, each with its own strengths and specialties, working together to create a more dynamic and resilient European economy.
That sounds pretty powerful. But what about those differences in investment behavior we discussed? How do we get Europeans to think more like investors and less like savers?
That's a crucial challenge, and it requires a multi-pronged approach. For one, we need to make investing more accessible and understandable for the average person.
Demystifying it a bit.
Right, exactly. Think financial literacy programs in schools, user-friendly online platforms, even innovative investment products that cater to different risk appetites.
Just making it less intimidating for people who might not be familiar with stocks and bonds.
Right, and it's not just about individual investors, it's also about creating a more robust and dynamic capital market in Europe, one that provides businesses with a wider range of funding options beyond traditional bank loans.
So venture capital, private equity, a thriving stock market.
Exactly. A more diverse and vibrant financial ecosystem with something for everyone. And this ties into the need for strategic public investment. Yes, fiscal sustainability is important, but the EU can't afford to be timid when it comes to investing in its future.
So no more austerity measures.
Well, it's not that simple. But we do need to think big and bold. Investing in cutting-edge infrastructure, research and development education, and skills training.
It's like planting seeds for the future, creating an environment where innovation can flourish and new industries can take root.
Exactly. And when it comes to innovation, we need to move beyond the traditional model of simply funding research and hoping for the best.
So what's the alternative?
We need to bridge that gap between the lab and the marketplace. Foster a culture of entrepreneurship and technology transfer. Think incubators, accelerators, partnerships between universities and businesses to commercialize these brilliant ideas.
So creating a more dynamic ecosystem for innovation, where ideas can flow freely and get the support they need to turn into real-world solutions.
That's the idea. And it's not just about high-tech gadgets and gizmos, it's also about social innovation, finding new and creative ways to address societal challenges like climate change, aging populations, inequality.
Europe has a rich history of social innovation, doesn't it?
It does, and we need to tap into that spirit to create a more sustainable and inclusive future.
Okay, so we've talked about the economy innovation. But what about the human side of all this? How do we ensure that everyone benefits from this great Europe we're envisioning?
That's where education and skills training come in. We need to equip people with the tools they need to thrive in a rapidly changing world. Think lifelong learning programs, apprenticeships, online courses that make it easy for people to upskill and reskill throughout their careers.
Making sure people aren't left behind as technology advances and the job market evolves.
Exactly. And it's not just about technical skills, it's also about critical thinking, problem solving, the ability to adapt to change. These are the skills that will make people resilient and empower them to take advantage of new opportunities.
So a more agile and adaptable workforce, ready to embrace the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century.
Precisely. And it's not just about jobs in the economy, it's also about quality of life. A truly great Europe would be one where people feel safe, secure, connected to their communities. A Europe with vibrant cultural scenes, thriving public spaces, affordable access to healthcare and education.
A Europe where people feel good about living, working, and raising families,
Mm.
where they feel a sense of belonging and optimism about the future.
Exactly. And that's a vision worth striving for. It won't be easy. It'll require collaboration, compromise, a willingness to challenge the status quo. But if we can pull it off, the rewards will be immense.
This has been an incredible deep dive. It's giving me so much to think about
Mm.
and so many ideas for how we can make Europe truly great.
And that's the whole point. We've given you the key takeaways from this fascinating report. But now it's up to you to connect the dots, draw your own conclusions, maybe even come up with your own ideas.
To everyone listening, we challenge you to take this information and run with it. Dig deeper, explore the source material, and most importantly, start thinking critically about what kind of future you want for Europe.
Because the decisions made today will shape the continent for generations to come.
Until next time, keep diving.